Most people pray with their minds filled with fear, doubt, and desperate need. They beg, plead, and repeat words, hoping God will hear their suffering. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something revolutionary that changes everything about how prayer actually works. Traditional prayer keeps you trapped in the very problem you're trying to escape. When you pray from lack, you're affirming lack. When you pray from fear, you're strengthening fear. This is why your prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling and return unanswered. You're actually reinforcing the very consciousness that created your problems in the first place. Joel understood this spiritual law that most religious teaching completely misses. The secret Joel revealed is this: effective prayer is not asking God for something. It's remembering what God already is. It's shifting from human pleading to spiritual knowing. This one understanding transforms your entire prayer experience in 60 seconds. Your breakthrough begins when you stop trying to get God to do something and start recognizing what God is already being. This is the foundation of mystical Christianity that Joel pioneered and taught throughout his ministry. He proved that when you understand the true mechanics of prayer, demonstration becomes natural and consistent, rather than hit or miss, hoping that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work at all. Joel discovered that God doesn't respond to your words, emotions, or desperate needs. God responds to your consciousness, your inner state of being, your spiritual awareness. When you align with this truth, prayer becomes instantaneous and powerful. This isn't religious theory. This is spiritual science that Joel proved through decades of consistent healing work. Think of it this way: you don't have to convince electricity to flow through a properly wired circuit. You simply flip the switch and connect to what already exists. Prayer works the same way when you understand the spiritual mechanics Joel revealed. The power is always there. The question is whether your consciousness is receptive to it. The 60-second transformation happens when you shift from asking God to heal you, provide for you, or protect you, to recognizing that God's nature is already wholeness, abundance, and perfect love, expressing through you right now. This isn't positive thinking or wishful hoping. This is recognition of what is spiritually true in this moment. This is spiritual science based on understanding the true nature of God and your relationship to divine consciousness. Joel proved this principle worked consistently for thousands of students across 4 decades of teaching and healing ministry that documented remarkable transformations in health, relationships, and supply. Here's what happens in those crucial 60 seconds. Instead of listing your problems to God, you spend that minute remembering God's perfection. Instead of describing your lack, you acknowledge divine abundance. Instead of focusing on illness, you recognize spiritual wholeness. This complete reversal of approach changes everything about your prayer experience. Joel taught that God doesn't know your problems because God only knows perfection. When you align your consciousness with God's knowing instead of your human concerns, you create the connection that allows healing and demonstration to unfold naturally. You're not trying to inform God about your troubles. You're informing yourself about God's truth. The transformation isn't in getting God to change circumstances. The transformation is in changing your consciousness to match God's perspective. From that elevated awareness, your outer experience begins to reflect your inner spiritual truth. This is why some people experience immediate results while others see gradual improvement over time. This is why some prayers seem answered immediately while others never manifest. It's not about God's willingness to help. It's about your consciousness being receptive to what God is already giving in every moment. Joel discovered that God is always giving, but human consciousness often blocks the reception through fear and doubt. Joel's revolutionary approach eliminates the separation between you and God that traditional prayer creates. Instead of talking to God as if God were separate from you, you recognize God as the very consciousness you are expressing through. This understanding dissolves the sense of distance that makes prayer feel like shouting across an empty void. The 60-second method is simple. Breathe deeply, release all sense of personal need, and spend those moments acknowledging the divine presence that is already perfect, complete, and expressing as your true being right now. You're not trying to get something from God. You're recognizing what you already are in God. You're not trying to get God's attention. You're giving attention to God. You're not asking for God's love. You're recognizing that God's love is what you are. You're not requesting God's power. You're acknowledging God's power as your spiritual identity. This shift from separation to unity changes everything about your spiritual experience. This shift from separation to unity, from asking to knowing, from human will to divine being, is what creates the miraculous results that Joel demonstrated and taught for over 4 decades of spiritual healing ministry. His students documented thousands of healings using this exact approach to prayer and spiritual practice. Margaret came to Joel's classes completely skeptical after years of unanswered prayers for her chronic pain. She had tried every religious approach, begged God countless times, and felt abandoned by divine love. Joel taught her the 60-second method. She was desperate enough to try anything, even though she doubted it would work any better than her previous attempts. Instead of praying about her pain, Margaret spent 60 seconds acknowledging God as perfect life expressing through her. She didn't mention her condition. She simply recognized divine wholeness as her true spiritual identity, not as something she hoped to receive. This felt strange at first because it went against everything she'd been taught about prayer. The first week she noticed moments where pain seemed to fade during her 60-second awareness sessions. By the 3rd week, she experienced hours of complete relief. After 2 months of consistent practice, her chronic condition had completely disappeared. Her doctors couldn't explain the improvement based on any medical intervention. Margaret later said the transformation wasn't just physical healing. She discovered a completely different relationship with God based on unity rather than separation, knowing rather than hoping, being rather than asking for divine intervention. Her entire understanding of spirituality changed through this simple practice. Robert's business was failing, creditors were calling, and traditional prayers for financial help seemed useless. Joel showed him how his prayers were actually reinforcing his consciousness of lack by constantly affirming his business problems to God. Every time Robert prayed about his financial troubles, he was strengthening his awareness of limitation rather than abundance. Robert learned to spend 60 seconds acknowledging divine abundance as the substance of all true supply. He stopped telling God about his financial troubles and started recognizing God's inexhaustible provision as his spiritual inheritance. This felt counterintuitive because his bank account and bills seemed to contradict any sense of abundance. Within 3 weeks, unexpected opportunities began appearing. A former client offered him a major contract. A business contact recommended him for consulting work. New revenue streams opened that he never could have imagined or planned through human effort alone. The solutions came from directions he hadn't even considered possible. Robert realized that God's abundance was always available, but his consciousness of lack had been blocking his awareness of infinite supply. The 60-second method opened his spiritual receptivity to what was already present and waiting. His financial situation completely turned around within 6 months of consistent practice. Sarah struggled with depression and anxiety for years. Her prayers felt like shouting into an empty void. She attended Joel's healing meetings, desperate for relief from her mental and emotional suffering that seemed beyond her control. Traditional counseling and medication had provided only temporary relief from symptoms that kept returning stronger than before. Joel taught Sarah that God doesn't know depression because God is pure joy, perfect peace, and unconditional love. Her 60-second practice involved acknowledging these qualities as her true spiritual nature rather than asking God to remove her negative emotions. This approach felt completely different from her previous attempts to pray away her problems. Gradually, Sarah began experiencing moments of inexplicable peace during her practice sessions. The anxiety attacks became less frequent. The depression lifted like fog disappearing when sunlight breaks through the clouds that had obscured her spiritual truth. She discovered that her emotional problems weren't her true identity after all. Sarah discovered that her true identity was God's joy expressing through her. The emotional problems were simply clouds of false belief that dissolved when she consistently recognized her divine nature through Joel's revolutionary prayer method. Within a year, she was completely free from depression and anxiety without any medication or therapy. These transformation stories aren't unique or exceptional. Joel documented thousands of similar healings over his 40-year ministry. The 60-second method works because it aligns your consciousness with spiritual truth, rather than human problems. Students from around the world reported similar breakthroughs when they applied Joel's teachings consistently and with proper understanding. The key is consistency and understanding. You must shift from human pleading to spiritual recognition. You must move from separation consciousness to unity awareness. You must transition from asking God for things to acknowledging what God already is. This isn't a technique you use occasionally. It becomes your natural way of relating to divine presence. This isn't magic or wishful thinking. This is spiritual science based on understanding the true nature of prayer, consciousness, and your relationship with divine presence. Joel proved these principles work when properly understood and consistently applied. The results speak for themselves across decades of documented healings and demonstrations. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond the basic 60-second method, Joel taught complementary techniques that deepen your spiritual practice. The first is what he called practicing the presence. Throughout your day, take micro moments to remember God's presence as your actual being. These brief acknowledgments build a foundation of spiritual awareness that supports your formal prayer periods. While walking, driving, or working, silently acknowledge divine love flowing through you. When facing challenges, pause briefly to recognize God's wisdom as your inner guidance. These small moments create a continuous thread of spiritual consciousness that weaves through your entire day, rather than limiting spiritual practice to specific prayer times. Joel discovered that maintaining spiritual awareness throughout daily activities creates a consciousness that is naturally receptive to divine healing and demonstration. You're not just practicing prayer for 60 seconds. You're living from spiritual consciousness continuously. This consistent awareness becomes the foundation for sustained transformation. This consistent awareness dissolves the separation between spiritual practice and regular life. Every moment becomes an opportunity to recognize God's presence and let that recognition transform your experience from the inside out. Your entire day becomes a prayer of recognition rather than just specific moments of formal spiritual practice. Another powerful complement to the 60-second method is what Joel called spiritual discernment. This involves learning to distinguish between thoughts that come from spiritual truth and thoughts that arise from human fear, doubt, or limitation. This skill becomes essential as you develop deeper spiritual sensitivity and awareness of the different qualities of thought. When negative thoughts appear, instead of fighting them or feeling guilty, you simply recognize them as suggestions that have no power over your spiritual identity. You don't give them attention or energy. You return to acknowledging your divine nature. This isn't suppression or denial. It's simply choosing which thoughts deserve your spiritual authority. Joel taught that you don't have to eliminate every negative thought to experience spiritual demonstration. You just have to stop giving spiritual authority to thoughts that contradict God's perfection expressing through you right now. The goal isn't perfect thinking, but proper discernment about which thoughts to follow and which to ignore. This discernment becomes easier with practice. You begin recognizing the difference between divine inspiration and human mental chatter. You learn to follow the guidance that comes from your spiritual consciousness rather than reactive emotional thinking. This skill protects your consciousness from being disturbed by every passing negative suggestion. The third complementary technique Joel taught is witnessing. This means observing your human experience from the perspective of your spiritual identity rather than being completely identified with personality, emotions, and circumstances. Witnessing creates healthy detachment that allows you to respond rather than react to life situations. When problems appear, you witness them as temporary appearances that have no power over your true being. When success comes, you witness it as divine expression rather than personal achievement. This witnessing dissolves the ego reactions that block spiritual receptivity and keeps you centered in spiritual truth regardless of changing circumstances. Joel emphasized that witnessing isn't detachment or indifference. It's seeing from God's perspective where everything is working together for good, because everything is an expression of divine love seeking to reveal itself through your experience. This perspective transforms how you interpret and respond to every situation. This witnessing consciousness naturally develops as you consistently practice the 60-second method. You begin living from spiritual awareness rather than being tossed around by every changing circumstance that appears in your human experience. You maintain your center in divine peace regardless of external conditions. These three techniques work together to create what Joel called a transparency for God. You become so aligned with spiritual consciousness that divine love, wisdom, and power flow through you naturally without human interference or ego manipulation. This is the goal of mystical Christianity that Joel pioneered and demonstrated throughout his ministry. The 60-second method establishes the foundation. Practicing the presence throughout your day maintains spiritual awareness. Discernment helps you follow divine guidance. Witnessing keeps you centered in your true identity, regardless of circumstances. Together, these practices create a stable spiritual consciousness that can handle any life situation. Joel taught that this isn't about becoming perfect or eliminating all human challenges. It's about maintaining your connection to spiritual truth so that divine healing and demonstration can unfold through you naturally and consistently. You don't become superhuman. You become transparently human, allowing God to express through you. When these techniques become natural rather than forced, you discover what Joel called the mystical life, where God's grace becomes your daily experience rather than something you only hope for during desperate moments. Spiritual consciousness becomes your natural state rather than something you have to work to achieve. Many students encounter a common obstacle. Their prayers feel mechanical or empty. They're following the 60-second method but not experiencing the inner transformation that should accompany authentic spiritual practice. This happens for specific reasons Joel identified and addressed in his advanced teachings for students who had been practicing for several months. The most frequent cause is trying to use the technique to manipulate outcomes rather than genuinely recognizing spiritual truth. If you're secretly hoping your 60 seconds will fix your problems, you're still operating from human will rather than divine surrender. This subtle motive makes all the difference in the effectiveness of your practice. Joel taught that the purpose isn't to get God to do what you want. The purpose is to align with what God is already doing. When your motive shifts from manipulation to recognition, the practice becomes authentic and powerful. The difference is between using God and being used by God for divine purposes. The solution is examining your heart honestly. Are you trying to use God, or are you opening to be used by God? This subtle but crucial difference determines whether your practice leads to genuine transformation or becomes another form of human willpower disguised as spiritual practice. Another common challenge is mental resistance during the 60-second practice. Your mind fills with worries, doubts, or distracting thoughts just when you're trying to focus on God's presence. Joel understood this phenomenon and offered practical guidance based on his years of experience helping students overcome this natural but temporary obstacle. He taught that mental resistance is actually a sign that your consciousness is shifting from human thinking to spiritual awareness. The ego naturally resists this shift because it threatens the ego's sense of control and importance. Understanding this helps you not take the resistance personally or assume you're doing something wrong. Instead of fighting distracting thoughts, Joel suggested acknowledging them briefly and then returning attention to spiritual truth. Think of it like training a puppy. You gently redirect attention without anger or frustration when the mind wanders. Force and struggle only create more mental agitation and resistance. With consistent practice, the mental resistance decreases naturally. Your consciousness becomes accustomed to spiritual focus. What initially felt difficult becomes effortless as your awareness stabilizes in divine presence rather than human mental chatter. The mind learns to cooperate with your spiritual intention rather than fighting it. The third obstacle many students face is impatience with results. They practice the 60-second method for a few days or weeks and expect dramatic transformations. When changes don't happen immediately, they conclude the technique doesn't work and abandon the practice before it has time to build the necessary consciousness for demonstration. Joel emphasized that spiritual development follows natural laws just like physical growth. A seed doesn't become a tree overnight. Consciousness doesn't shift from years of human thinking to spiritual awareness without a natural unfolding process. Every moment of practice is building a foundation that will eventually manifest as improved conditions. He taught that every sincere moment of spiritual recognition is building a foundation of consciousness that will eventually manifest as improved health, relationships, supply, and overall life experience. Nothing is ever wasted in spiritual practice. Even when you don't see immediate results, Transformation is happening at consciousness levels. The key is practicing for the joy of recognizing God's presence, rather than practicing for results. When you find fulfillment in the spiritual connection itself, demonstration naturally follows as a byproduct of elevated consciousness. The practice becomes its own reward rather than a means to an end. Students sometimes worry they're not doing the technique correctly because their experience doesn't match others' stories. Joel taught that spiritual practice is deeply individual. Your relationship with God is unique and can't be compared to anyone else's experience. Divine consciousness expresses through each person according to their particular nature and circumstances. Some people experience immediate emotional relief. Others notice gradual changes in circumstances. Some feel deep peace during practice. Others experience insights and inspiration. All of these responses indicate that spiritual consciousness is awakening and working. There's no single correct way to experience the 60-second method. Joel's advice was simple. Trust the process and remain consistent regardless of how your individual experience unfolds. The divine intelligence that created you knows exactly how to work through your particular consciousness and circumstances. Your spiritual development will unfold in the way that's perfect for your unique spiritual journey. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Advanced practitioners learn to integrate the 60-second method into challenging situations as they arise. When confronted with illness, lack, conflict, or any problem, they immediately shift into spiritual recognition rather than human reactive thinking. This becomes an automatic response that protects consciousness from being disturbed by appearances. Joel taught a businessman named David this advanced application. During a crucial negotiation that could save his company, David felt panic rising. Instead of succumbing to fear, he spent 60 seconds acknowledging divine wisdom and love as the substance of all true business relationships. This inner shift immediately affected the entire atmosphere. The shift in David's consciousness was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. His anxiety transformed into confidence. His desperation became clarity. The negotiation proceeded smoothly, and both parties found mutually beneficial solutions that exceeded everyone's expectations. David's spiritual consciousness had elevated the entire situation. David realized that the 60-second method wasn't just for quiet prayer time. It was a tool for maintaining spiritual consciousness during the exact moments when human thinking would typically create problems and limitation. This real-time application of Joel's teaching transformed his entire approach to business challenges. Advanced students also learn to apply Joel's method to other people's problems without interfering with their free will. When someone shares their troubles with you, instead of giving human advice or feeling emotionally disturbed, you silently recognize God's perfection operating in their experience. This is one of the most powerful forms of spiritual healing. Maria practiced this when her adult son struggled with addiction. Instead of constantly worrying and trying to control his choices, she would spend 60 seconds acknowledging divine love as his true identity, regardless of his current behavior or circumstances. This practice kept her peaceful while supporting his healing at the consciousness level. This practice kept Maria peaceful and centered while her son worked through his challenges. More importantly, her consciousness of his spiritual perfection seemed to support his eventual recovery in ways that her human worry and interference never could have accomplished. Her spiritual recognition created space for his own spiritual awakening. Joel taught that this silent recognition of others' divine nature is one of the most powerful forms of prayer. You're not trying to change anyone. You're simply holding them in the light of their spiritual truth. This consciousness of their perfection supports their own spiritual development without violating their free will or personal journey. Another advanced application involves using the 60-second method for global situations. When news reports or world events trigger fear and hopelessness, Joel taught students to respond from spiritual consciousness rather than human emotional reaction. This transforms you from part of the problem into part of the solution at the consciousness level. Instead of being overwhelmed by world problems, you spend 60 seconds recognizing divine love as the only true power operating in human affairs. You acknowledge God's wisdom working through all situations, even those that appear chaotic or destructive to human perception. This doesn't mean ignoring problems, but seeing them from spiritual perspective. This practice doesn't make you indifferent to human suffering. It connects you to the spiritual power that can actually help resolve problems rather than just adding more fear and negativity to collective human consciousness. Your consciousness of divine harmony contributes to the healing of global challenges. Students who consistently practice this approach report feeling more hopeful about world conditions and more inspired to take constructive action in their communities. They become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Their spiritual consciousness radiates healing influence wherever they go. The most advanced application of Joel's method is living from continuous spiritual recognition. Instead of compartmentalizing prayer into specific times, your entire life becomes a recognition of God's presence expressing through every activity and relationship. This is what Joel called the mystical life, where everything becomes an expression of spiritual consciousness. This doesn't mean walking around in a spiritual trance or disconnecting from practical responsibilities. It means maintaining awareness that divine intelligence is operating through you as you handle work, relationships, finances, health, and all aspects of human experience. You remain fully engaged while spiritually centered. Joel lived this way during his later years. Students reported that being in his presence was healing because his consciousness was so consistently aligned with spiritual truth. He had become what he called a transparency for God. Divine love, wisdom, and healing power flowed through him naturally without human effort or manipulation. This level of development takes time and consistent practice, but it represents the ultimate goal of mystical Christianity that Joel pioneered. You become a clear channel for divine love, wisdom, and healing power in the world. Your very presence becomes a blessing to everyone you encounter throughout your daily activities. Your new understanding of prayer transforms everything about your spiritual life. You no longer approach God as a beggar hoping for divine favors. You recognize yourself as God's beloved expression, already complete and perfect in spiritual truth. This understanding eliminates the sense of separation and unworthiness that characterizes traditional religious approaches. This shift eliminates the anxiety and desperation that used to characterize your prayer life. Instead of worrying whether God will answer your prayers, you rest in the knowing that God's nature is already expressing as your true being. Prayer becomes communion rather than petition, recognition rather than request. Your 60-second practice becomes a joyful recognition rather than a desperate petition. You discover that communion with God is your natural state, not something you have to earn through perfect behavior or eloquent words. This understanding brings tremendous peace and confidence to your spiritual journey. This understanding ripples through every area of your life. Relationships improve because you're not trying to get love from others. Finances stabilize because you're not operating from consciousness of lack. Health improves because you're aligned with divine wholeness. Everything changes when your foundation shifts from human need to spiritual recognition. The transformation affects how you handle daily challenges. Instead of immediately reacting with fear, anger, or worry when problems appear, you automatically return to spiritual recognition. This response becomes as natural as breathing. You develop spiritual reflexes that protect your consciousness from being disturbed by appearances. Your family and friends notice changes in your energy and presence. You become more peaceful, confident, and loving without trying to be different. The spiritual consciousness you're cultivating naturally expresses as improved character and behavior. People are drawn to the peace and joy they sense in you. Work becomes an opportunity to express divine qualities rather than just earning money. Relationships become chances to recognize God's love in others rather than trying to get your needs met through human personality connections. Every interaction becomes an opportunity for spiritual recognition and expression. Every aspect of your life becomes infused with spiritual meaning and purpose. You're living from the inside out instead of being controlled by external circumstances and other people's opinions or behavior. Your spiritual center becomes unshakable regardless of what appears in your human experience. Joel's 60-second method has given you the key to mystical Christianity that transforms ordinary human existence into extraordinary spiritual expression. You've discovered that effective prayer is recognition, not petition, unity, not separation, being, not asking. This understanding revolutionizes your entire approach to spirituality and daily living. This isn't the end of your spiritual journey. It's the beginning of a deeper adventure into the infinite possibilities that unfold when human consciousness aligns with divine truth consistently and authentically. You now have practical tools that work in real-life situations rather than just theoretical spiritual knowledge. You now have practical tools for maintaining spiritual awareness regardless of what appears in your human experience. You can handle success and failure, health and illness, abundance and lack from the same centered place of divine recognition. Your spiritual foundation becomes unshakable. Most importantly, you've learned that God's grace isn't something you have to earn or deserve. It's something you simply recognize and allow to express through your willingness to see from spiritual perspective rather than human limitation. This understanding brings tremendous freedom and peace to your spiritual journey. Your prayer life will never be the same. You've moved beyond begging God for help to recognizing God as the very consciousness you express in every moment. This is the mystical Christianity that Joel Goldsmith pioneered and shared with thousands of students worldwide. You're now part of this lineage of spiritual understanding and practice. The 60-second method is simple, but its effects are profound and lasting. Continue practicing with consistency and sincerity. Trust the process even when results don't appear immediately. Divine consciousness is always working, even when human perception can't detect the changes happening at deeper levels of your being. Remember that you're not trying to get God to do something for you. You're allowing God to be what God already is through you. This understanding makes all the difference between prayer that works and prayer that feels empty and unanswered. You're now equipped with the understanding that transforms prayer from petition to recognition. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.